It was one of those bone-dry summer afternoons where the heat ripples off the asphalt like waves on an invisible ocean. The kind of day when gas stations along the highway feel like brief oases of shade and engine fumes, and somewhere off Interstate 12, in a dusty town no one ever really stops to remember, a faded red minivan sputtered to a halt beside pump number 4 at an old Sinclair station with peeling green signage and a lopsided soda machine that hadn't worked right since the early 2000s. And in the backseat of that van, panting and wagging his tail despite the suffocating heat, was a golden retriever named Toby, just 5 years old, soft-eared, bright-eyed, and the kind of loyal who would have walked barefoot across coals if it meant staying close to the humans he adored. But what Toby didn't know, what his beating heart and trusting eyes hadn't caught on to, was that the family he thought was his forever had already made a quiet decision in a conversation that had started with sighs and ended with silence, a decision wrapped in the cruel justifications of inconvenience and timing. And we'll get another one when life settles down, and as the father filled up the tank and the mother rifled through snack aisles and the kids giggled inside the air-conditioned car, Toby was led out by his leash under the pretense of a quick stretch, tail wagging, nose sniffing the concrete curiously, as if even the stained ground was a wonderland of discovery. And when the leash was slipped off for just a second, "He's safe here. It's fenced," the father mumbled. They all climbed back into the van, windows rolled up, engine coughing to life. And without looking back, without a second thought, they drove away. Van wheels kicking up a swirl of dust that drifted around Toby's golden fur like a farewell veil, and the retriever, initially wagging and then slowly turning in confused circles, walked toward the edge of the lot, eyes scanning every vehicle that passed, certain that it was a game, or maybe a mistake, because why else would the people he loved more than life itself drive away without him? And for hours he sat by the pumps, his tongue lolling, his head perking up every time a red vehicle passed, a small whimper escaping whenever they weren't his. The sun sinking slowly over the barren land and casting long shadows that wrapped around Toby like cold fingers, and the gas station attendant, a wiry, sun-spotted man named Carl, who had worked there for 30 years and seen more people leave things behind than he could count, watched the dog's hope slowly wither with the day. And despite himself, Carl brought out a bowl of water, then a slice of leftover ham from his sandwich, and finally an old blanket from the utility closet in the back, placing them gently beside the dog without touching him, speaking softly like Toby was a ghost he didn't want to startle. And for 3 days, Toby stayed there, unmoving unless a red vehicle appeared, refusing to wander far, guarding the exact square of concrete where the van had left him, like a soldier holding vigil for a fallen comrade. And on the 3rd night, when the rain finally broke the heat in a sudden hiss of thunder and wild drops that soaked the cracked earth the side door and gestured wordlessly for Toby to come in. And the dog, drenched and shivering, stared for a moment before stepping over the threshold into a dim-lit break room that smelled of old coffee and rubber, where Carl dried him off with a towel that had once been used for oil spills and offered an old bed pillow as a cushion. And though Toby didn't wag, he also didn't leave. And by the 5th day, Carl called his daughter Jamie, a local vet who had always had a soft spot for retrievers since their childhood dog Max, and asked her if she'd come take a look. And when Jamie arrived, something happened that Carl hadn't seen in a long time. Toby stood, tail hesitating, then moved toward her with the quiet desperation of someone afraid to hope again, pressing his head into her legs as if to say, "Please don't vanish too." And Jamie crouched, wrapping her arms around his soaked, dust-caked fur, and whispered, "You're not going to be alone anymore." And it might have been the angle of the light, or maybe just the dust in the air, but Carl could have sworn he saw tears in the dog's eyes, and from that moment, Toby's story took a turn no one expected. Jamie took him home that night, to a modest farmhouse just outside of town, where 3 rescue dogs already roamed free across 2 fenced acres. And though at first he stood stiff and uncertain near the door, within days he was weaving through the kitchen like he'd always belonged there, learning the patterns of the land, the corners of the barn, the schedule of evening belly rubs and morning walks, with the sunrise breaking golden across the fields. And slowly, the dull ache in his chest began to ease, replaced with a new rhythm, a new trust that was cautious but rebuilding. And yet the story didn't end there, because what Jamie didn't know, what even Carl hadn't realized, is that one of the customers at the gas station had recorded Toby's loyal wait on their phone. A time-lapse of 3 days condensed into a haunting minute of footage, the stillness, the waiting, the moment the rain fell. And that video went viral after being posted with the caption, "They left him. He stayed. This dog's loyalty will break your heart," spreading across social media like wildfire, drawing tears and outrage. And then something else entirely, letters, donations, people across the country asking how they could help, children sending hand-drawn pictures of Toby in crayon and glitter, schools naming him their honorary dog of the month. And amidst all this, Jamie set up a small online page to update people on Toby's progress, where videos of him learning to trust again, to play again, to chase butterflies in the backyard, racked up millions of views and loving comments from strangers who said Toby reminded them of the good left in the world. But perhaps the most remarkable twist came nearly 6 weeks later, when a local journalist, curious about the backstory behind the viral sensation, traced the license plate seen faintly in the original video to a suburb just 40 miles away, knocking on the door of a stucco house where the father answered and was immediately defensive, saying they had lost track of the dog and that he he probably found someone else. Not realizing their carelessness had made them the villains in a worldwide story about abandonment and redemption. And though no legal action could be taken, the public backlash was swift and intense. But more importantly, it brought attention to a widespread issue: animals left behind, forgotten at rest stops, tied to fences, abandoned on highways. And Toby's story became the banner for a new movement. A campaign called Loyal Hearts, started by Jamie and Carl, raising funds for tracking collars, emergency shelter partnerships, and awareness materials in gas stations and roadside stops across the country. And while Toby, now older, wiser, and fully healed, never understood the fame or the movement he had sparked, he seemed to know one thing for sure: that he was finally, irrevocably, home. And in the late evenings, when the world quieted and the stars emerged, he would sit on the back porch beside Jamie, his head resting on her lap as she read or hummed softly, the red-orange sun painting golden streaks in his fur. And though he sometimes still stirred in his sleep with a whimper echoes of the station, of wheels turning and not returning, it was always followed by a gentle touch, a quiet word, and the heartbeat of someone who had promised never to leave and kept it. As the seasons changed, Toby's life continued to flourish in ways Jamie never expected. But the echoes of his past still lingered, like the faintest scent of earth after a summer storm, something that could never fully be erased. It was the middle of autumn when the winds began to carry a different weight, cooler and sharper, turning the trees outside Jamie's farmhouse into a riot of amber and gold. And Toby, now settled into the rhythms of his new life, began to show signs of something deeper, a sense of protection that went beyond the simple affection he had learned to give. A fierce, almost instinctual need to guard his family from even the smallest dangers. And it began with the way he reacted when a stranger's truck pulled into the driveway late one evening, the headlights casting long shadows against the barn walls as the engine rumbled to a halt. Toby was out of the door before anyone could register the sound, bounding across the yard with a force that rattled the dried leaves beneath his paws, growling low in his throat, a growl that Jamie had never heard from him before, one that sounded more like a warning than anything else. And for a split second, Jamie thought perhaps it was just the lingering anxiety from his abandonment. But when she saw the truck's driver, a man in his mid-40s, rough around the edges, with hands that looked like they had worked a lifetime of hard labor, she knew this wasn't a friendly visit. The man climbed out of the truck with a hasty, nervous glance at the house before making his way toward her. And before Jamie could say anything, Toby was in front of her, his body stiff and unwavering, his ears flattened, his growl growing louder. The man stopped short, his eyes flicking from Toby to Jamie, confusion and something darker in his expression. And that was when Toby's behavior changed. With a sudden, sharp bark, he leapt forward, his teeth bared, his fur bristling, and Jamie took a step back, surprised at how quickly the dog had shifted from cautious to protective. "Hey, whoa, calm down," the man said, holding up his hands as if trying to placate an aggressive animal. But there was nothing in his eyes that seemed like he was afraid, and that made Jamie even more uneasy. "I'm just looking for my dog," he said, his voice rough and hoarse, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in days. "I heard there was a golden retriever here, one that was left at a gas station. I think it's mine." Toby's growl intensified, his muscles taut and ready, as if he were already deciding whether to charge or to wait, and Jamie stood frozen, the hairs on the back of her neck prickling. "What's your name?" Jamie asked, her voice steady, but laced with an underlying edge. "Rick," the man said, his eyes shifting between Jamie and the dog, as if he wasn't sure who to trust. "My wife and I, we didn't mean to leave him. Things got tough. He's just a dog, you know. Not like he's a person. He was just too much. We couldn't afford the vet bills. I left him there. But I've changed. I've been trying to find him. I know I screwed up, okay? I just want him back." Jamie's heart twisted in her chest. She could see the man's desperation, but there was something in his eyes, something she couldn't quite place, that told her he wasn't as regretful as he was letting on. And then she glanced at Toby, whose hackles were still raised, his stance never wavering, his eyes locked on Rick with the kind of focus that only comes from a dog who knows the danger of a person's intentions. Without a word, Toby began to slowly back away, his body language shifting as if he had made a decision, and Jamie's heart sank. She turned to look at the dog, her voice soft as she crouched down to his level. "Toby," she called, her hand outstretched, and without hesitation, Toby walked toward her, his tail low, eyes glancing back at Rick, before he finally reached her side and sat quietly, his body leaning into her as if to say, "I'm safe here." "You can't have him," Jamie said finally, her voice firm, a protective growl of her own settling in her chest. Rick didn't argue, but there was a moment of silence, of tension in the air, before he turned and walked back to his truck, leaving Jamie standing there with Toby at her feet, the man's footsteps growing fainter as he drove off, the dust kicking up in the rearview mirrors like memories being buried in the earth. It was after that night that something shifted in Toby, something deeper than before, as if he realized for the first time just how fragile the line between loyalty and betrayal could be. And Jamie, sensing that Toby was still carrying the weight of something unspoken, began to notice small changes in his behavior, an occasional nervous glance at passing vehicles, a sudden stiffness when unfamiliar people came to the farm, and it was clear to her that the dog, for all his newfound happiness, still carried the scars of the past, the wounds of abandonment and uncertainty. And Jamie knew that in order for him to fully heal, she would have to give him more than just a home. She would have to give him trust in a world that had failed him once. It was then that that Jamie decided to take him on a journey of his own, to retrace the steps of his abandonment, to face the very place where he had been left behind, to show him that he wasn't just a dog, that he had a family now, that he was part of something bigger than the hurtful things people had done to him. And so, one quiet morning in the late autumn, as the first frost of the year began to glitter across the grass, Jamie drove Toby to the gas station, the place that had been the beginning of his story, and in many ways, the end of his old life. She could see the hesitation in his eyes as they pulled into the same lot where months ago he had sat alone, waiting. The gas station looked unchanged. The same faded green signs, the same old pumps, the same rusty convenience store that had long since stopped selling anything anyone wanted. Jamie parked the car and opened the door, allowing Toby to step out. He hesitated for only a moment, then walked forward, sniffing the air, his nose twitching as memories rushed back like a flood. And for the first time since that day, Toby sat by the pumps again, his eyes not filled with confusion, not with abandonment, but with a quiet understanding, as if to say, "I'm not that dog anymore." He turned to Jamie, who had followed him, her heart heavy but full of determination, and she crouched down beside him, placing her hand on his back. "You're safe now," she whispered, and Toby, as if to reassure her, leaned into her touch, his tail giving a small, tentative wag. It was a moment of closure, the kind that can only come after a long journey of healing and understanding. And as Jamie stood, looking at the place that had once been the source of so much pain, she realized that Toby's story wasn't just about abandonment. It was about resilience, about the ability to rebuild from the wreckage of the past and rise stronger, more determined. And as the first rays of sunlight cut through the morning mist, Jamie knew that Toby's journey wasn't just over, it was just beginning. And this time, he was going to run with it, side by side with the family who had learned the most important lesson of all, that love, once given, can never truly be lost. As the winter approached, Jamie and Toby grew closer, and life on the farm seemed to settle into a rhythm, a peaceful routine that held the echoes of joy and healing. Toby's coat grew thicker, as if nature itself had wrapped him in a blanket of warmth and protection, and he spent his days running through the fields, his paws crunching in the frosty grass, the wind tousling his fur as he raced beside Jamie. The world had changed for both of them in ways that were subtle but profound. Jamie had found a companion who understood her without words, who felt the deep currents of her heart and matched her pace. And Toby had found something he had never known before, a family who didn't leave, a place where he wasn't just an animal, but a true friend, a partner in the adventures of life. It was early one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the farmhouse, that Jamie realized just how far Toby had come. They were sitting on the porch together, her legs stretched out in front of her, a blanket wrapped wrapped around her shoulders as the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, the world turning soft and quiet beneath the weight of the gentle snow. Toby sat beside her, his head resting on her lap, his eyes closed in contentment, his breathing steady and calm. No longer the nervous, anxious dog who had arrived so many months ago, but a creature at peace with his past, at ease with the present, and eager for whatever the future held. It was a moment of perfect stillness, one that stretched out in time, a feeling of completeness that filled the air like the scent of pine and fresh snow. And Jamie couldn't help but smile, brushing her fingers through Toby's thick fur, the bond between them as strong as the roots of the old oak tree in the yard. For a long time, she had feared she was broken. Too, a person who had given too much of herself and had been left with pieces that didn't fit together anymore. But now, in the presence of this gentle soul who had found his way back from a past of pain and loss, she realized that she wasn't broken at all. She had simply been waiting, just as Toby had been, for the right moment, for the right person, for the right love to fill the spaces that had once been filled with doubt and fear. And that love had come in the form of a dog who had once been discarded but had become the center of her world. As winter settled over the farm, the days grew shorter and the nights colder. Jamie knew that Toby's journey had not only been about healing from his past, it had also been about teaching her how to heal, how to trust again, how to open her heart in ways she had long since forgotten. The first snowfall of the season brought with it a sense of finality, a closing chapter to the story that had begun with the harsh abandonment of a dog at a gas station, but also the beginning of something entirely new, something filled with possibilities. And as the days passed, Toby's behavior continued to evolve. He was no longer just the protector of Jamie's heart. He had become the protector of the farm itself, the guardian of their little slice of paradise. A dog whose sense of duty and loyalty extended to everything and everyone who entered their lives. No visitor could come to the house without Toby greeting them with his watchful gaze, his ears perked, his stance tall and proud. He had become the protector of their land, the one who kept the predators away, whether they were foxes, raccoons, or the occasional coyote that wandered too close. But it wasn't just physical protection that Toby offered, it was emotional protection as well. Jamie noticed that her friends and neighbors, when they came to visit, seemed to smile a little more, laugh a little louder when Toby was around. His presence had a way of lightening the air, of making everything feel a little more safe, a little more secure. People who had once been skeptical of his aggressive past now saw the dog for what he truly was, a beacon of strength and kindness, a creature who had been through the fire and had come out stronger, more resilient, and more compassionate than anyone could have imagined. One evening, as Jamie was cleaning the barn, a family friend named Lucy came by to check on them, bringing her 2 young children with her. The moment they arrived, Toby's protective instincts kicked in, he positioned himself in front of Jamie, his body tense and alert. But Lucy, a dog lover herself, had met Toby before and knew how to handle him. She slowly extended her hand, her voice calm and soothing. And Toby, after a long moment of assessing her intentions, took a step forward, sniffing her hand before gently licking it, a sign of trust that Jamie hadn't seen in the dog since the day he had arrived. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Toby, the dog who had been left behind, was now extending his trust to others. That night, as the family sat around the fire, sipping hot cocoa and sharing stories, Toby lay contentedly at Jamie's feet, his head resting on her lap as he watched the children play in the yard. For the first time, he seemed to truly enjoy the company of others, to understand that not all humans were like those who had abandoned him. And as Jamie looked down at him, she realized just how far he had come. He had gone from being a stray, a castaway, to becoming the heart of their home. The one who had taught her that love wasn't something to be taken for granted. It was something to be earned, something to be nurtured, and something that, once found, could never truly be lost again. Over the next few months, Jamie and Toby grew even closer, each day deepening their bond, each moment a reminder of how far they had come together. The once uncertain dog had transformed into a creature of deep loyalty and affection. And Jamie, too, had grown, learning to trust again, to open her heart to the world, knowing that, just as Toby had found a new beginning, so could she. One spring morning, as the first signs of warmth began to seep into the air, Jamie stood in the yard, looking out over the land she and Toby had come to call their own. The trees were beginning to bud, and the flowers were pushing up through the earth, heralding the arrival of a new season. Toby stood beside her, his head held high, his gaze focused on the horizon, his tail wagging gently as he stood guard over their home. Jamie smiled softly, reaching down to pet him. And for the first time since she had found him, she didn't see the dog who had been abandoned at a gas station, the dog who had been left to fend for himself in a cruel world. Instead, she saw a dog who had found his place in the world, a dog who had found his family, a dog who had found love. The world, for both of them, was finally at peace, and as the seasons continued to turn, as the years passed, Jamie and Toby's story became one of legend, a tale of resilience, of love that had been lost and found again, of a bond that nothing could ever break. They were no longer just two beings living in a farmhouse on a quiet piece of land. They were a family, their lives intertwined in ways that no one, not even the careless owners who had abandoned Toby, could ever have imagined. And in the quiet moments, when the world was still, and the only sound was the whisper of the wind through the trees, Jamie would sit with Toby by her side, watching the sunset, knowing that no matter what had happened before, they had each other now, and that, she realized, was all that truly mattered.